My wife passed away. I gave my mother-in-law $200 every week for years, until I found the... Javon thought he was doing the right thing, keeping his promise, paying quietly, never asking questions. But during his weekly transfer that Friday, a small detail in the routine transaction didn't match the story he'd been told for 3 years. His stomach dropped and his hands went cold around his phone, like the room suddenly lost air. Because the thing he found wasn't just proof, it was a doorway to something that should have stayed buried. And once he follows it, everything his mother-in-law told him will unravel. Before we continue following Javon's journey to uncover the truth, please hit that like button to support the channel and subscribe so you don't miss other emotionally gripping drama stories. I'm curious where you're watching from. Are you tuning in from New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, or maybe Houston? Let me know in the comments below. Now let's see what Javon will do with this troubling detail he just discovered. Javon Sterling's phone buzzed against the kitchen counter as he finished his morning coffee. Friday, 7:30 a.m., time for the weekly ritual that had defined his last 3 years. He opened his banking app with practiced efficiency, navigating to the transfer screen he knew by heart. $200 to Delphine Hayes, medical expenses, just like he'd promised Nyla before she passed. The transaction screen loaded and Javon entered the familiar details. Delphine's account number, the same routing information he had memorized months ago. His finger hovered over the confirm button for just a moment, not from hesitation, but from the quiet weight of keeping a promise to the woman he'd loved more than breathing. Nyla had made him swear in those final weeks when the cancer was winning that he'd take care of her mother. She's going to need help with her medical bills, Nyla had whispered, her hand cold in his. Promise me you'll be there for her. He'd promised, and Javon Sterling didn't break his word. The transfer completed with its usual confirmation screen, but something caught his eye. A small notification line he'd never noticed before. Recipient information recently updated. Javon frowned, scrolling back through his transfer history. The notification appeared 3 times in the past month, always after his Friday payments. His engineering mind, trained to spot patterns and anomalies, filed the detail away like a misaligned bolt in an otherwise perfect assembly. He screenshot the confirmation page, a habit he'd developed for his own records, and saved it to a folder on his phone labeled Records. 3 years of weekly transfers, each one documented, each one a small tribute to the woman whose absence still echoed through every corner of his carefully ordered life. Javon had always been methodical, whether troubleshooting industrial systems at work or managing his personal finances. Organization brought clarity, and clarity brought peace. But as he stared at that notification line, something shifted in his chest. Not panic, not anger, just a subtle recalibration, like a sensor detecting an unexpected reading. Delphine had never mentioned updating her banking information. In their weekly calls, she talked about doctor appointments, prescription costs, the endless struggle of managing her health on a fixed income. Never banking changes. Javon locked his phone and finished his coffee in the quiet of his kitchen. Outside, the neighborhood was waking up, sprinklers hissing on front lawns, garage doors rumbling open, the distant hum of morning commuters. Life moving forward while he held vigil over the past. He'd made peace with this rhythm, this weekly act of remembrance disguised as financial support. It connected him to Nyla in a way that felt sacred, unbreakable. He saved the screenshot because that tiny update felt like the first crack in a story that never changed. The video call connected just after noon, Delphine's face filling his laptop screen with the same wary expression she'd worn for months. Her graying hair was pulled back loosely, and the lighting in her living room cast deep shadows under her eyes. She looked fragile, smaller somehow than the last time they'd spoken, though Javon couldn't pinpoint exactly what had changed. Javon, honey, she said, her voice carrying that familiar note of gratitude mixed with exhaustion. I got the transfer this morning. You're too good to me. You know that? Too good. She paused, pressing a hand to her chest in a gesture that had become routine during their calls. I don't know what I'd do without you. Nyla raised you right. She'd be so proud of how you're taking care of her old mama. The words should have brought comfort, the way they had for 3 years. Instead, Javon found himself studying Delphine's face more carefully than usual. She looked tired, yes, but there was something else. A sharpness behind her eyes that didn't quite match the frailty in her voice. He pushed the observation aside. Grief could make anyone paranoid, and Delphine had been grieving longer than most. Of course, Javon said, keeping his tone steady. Nyla made me promise to help with your medical expenses. I'm glad I can do something. He leaned forward slightly, his engineering instincts prompting him to gather more data. Speaking of which, I've been thinking it might be easier if I paid the doctors and pharmacy directly. Save you the hassle of handling the money transfers, especially when you're not feeling well. The change in Delphine's expression was subtle but unmistakable. The soft vulnerability vanished for just a moment, replaced by something harder, more calculating. Then it was gone, covered by a theatrical sigh and a shake of her head. Oh, honey, that's sweet of you to offer. But these medical places, they're so complicated with their billing systems, she said, her hand fluttering dismissively. Different insurance networks, co-pays that change every month, specialists who want cash up front. It's easier for me to handle it my way. I know which doctors to pay when, which pharmacies give me the best deals for my medications. Her voice grew more strained, more fragile. Besides, I'd hate to burden you with all those details. You work so hard already. Javon nodded, but something cold was settling in his stomach. In 3 years of these calls, Delphine had never once mentioned insurance networks or copay schedules. She'd never offered specifics about which doctors she was seeing or what medications she needed. Every conversation followed the same pattern: gratitude, vague health complaints, and gentle reminders of his promise to Nyla. I understand, he said carefully, but maybe you could give me the names of your main doctors. I'd like to know where my support is going. Make sure you are getting the best care. It was a reasonable request, the kind any concerned family member might make. Delphine's response was swift and practiced. Javon, you know I appreciate everything you do, but talking about medical details just makes me more anxious. The doctors say stress is bad for my condition. Her eyes grew glassy with unshed tears. Sometimes I feel like such a burden, like I'm taking advantage of your good heart. Maybe I should just... No, Javon said quickly, hating how easily she could still trigger his protective instincts. You're not a burden, Delphine. You're family. But even as he said the words, he was noting how smoothly she'd deflected his question, how expertly she'd redirected the conversation back to his guilt and obligation. The call ended 20 minutes later with the usual pleasantries and promises to check in soon. Javon closed his laptop and sat in the silence of his living room, processing what had just happened. Delphine's refusal to provide basic information, her immediate pivot to emotional manipulation when pressed, it wasn't the behavior of someone who simply needed medical support. For the first time, he wondered if her grief sounded rehearsed. Javon hadn't planned to drive to Delphine's house that Saturday afternoon. He'd been running errands, picking up dry cleaning, stopping by the hardware store for a new air filter, when he found himself on her street with a box of Nyla's books in his back seat. Books he'd been meaning to return for months. Books Delphine had mentioned wanting back during one of their calls. It seemed like the perfect excuse for an unannounced visit. The small ranch house looked the same as it had since Nyla's childhood. White siding that needed fresh paint, a front yard dominated by the oak tree where Nyla had hung a tire swing 20 years ago. Javon parked in the driveway and grabbed the box from his back seat, walking up the familiar path to the front door. Through the living room window, he could see movement inside, a figure moving with quick, purposeful steps. He knocked and waited, hearing footsteps approach the door, with none of the hesitant shuffle Delphine usually described during their calls. When the door opened, Delphine stood there in gardening clothes, soil under her fingernails, and a light sheen of sweat on her forehead. She looked vibrant, energetic. Nothing like the frail woman who'd struggled through their video call just yesterday. Javon! The surprise in her voice was genuine, followed immediately by something that looked almost like panic. I wasn't expecting you, honey. What brings you by? Found these books in my closet, he said, holding up the box. Thought you might want them back. He studied her face, noting the healthy flush in her cheeks, the steady way she held herself upright. Looks like you've been busy in the garden. Delphine's hand went to her hair self-consciously, and Javon caught a glimpse of the transformation happening in real time. Her posture began to shift, her shoulders drooping slightly as if an invisible weight had settled across them. The vibrant energy he glimpsed through the window seemed to drain from her features. Oh yes, just trying to keep up with the weeds, she said, her voice taking on the familiar note of exhaustion. Doctor says a little fresh air might help with my condition, but I probably overdid it again. She leaned against the door frame as if the brief conversation had already tired her. Some days are better than others. You know how it is. From across the yard, Mrs. Thompson looked up from her own garden and waved. Afternoon, Javon. Good to see Delphine getting out there with her vegetables. She's been working on that garden bed all morning. More energy than I have, that's for sure. The elderly neighbor's cheerful observation hung in the air like an accusation. Delphine's smile became strained, forced. Oh, you know how neighbors exaggerate, she said quickly, though Mrs. Thompson had already turned back to her roses. I was just pulling a few weeds, nothing strenuous. Probably shouldn't have even done that much. Javon nodded slowly, taking in the disconnect between what he was seeing and what he was being told. The woman in front of him had clearly been involved in serious yard work. Her clothes were dirty, her movements still carried the fluid ease of someone who'd been physically active for hours. Yet she was performing frailty like an actress, stepping into character mid-scene. Well, I don't want to keep you, he said, setting the box down on the small table beside the door. Just wanted to get these back to you. Thank you, honey. You're always so thoughtful. Delphine's gratitude sounded automatic now, like a recording played at the wrong speed. I should probably go rest now. All this activity has me feeling a bit dizzy. Javon said his goodbyes and walked back to his car, but instead of leaving immediately, he sat behind the wheel and thought about what he'd just witnessed. The vigorous woman, working in her garden, the quick pivot to performed weakness the moment she'd seen him. It felt like watching someone step behind a mask. In the car, his chest tightened as the lie finally became something he could measure. That night, Javon spread 3 years of bank statements across his dining room table like pieces of a puzzle he'd never thought to solve. The documents created a timeline of Friday transfers, each one a faithful $200 payment to Delphine Hayes. But now, with suspicion sharpening his focus, he began to see patterns that had been invisible when viewed through the lens of simple obligation. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through months of saved screenshots, confirmation pages, receipt images, the occasional text exchange with Delphine about timing. What had started as careful record-keeping was now becoming evidence of something he couldn't yet name. Javon arranged the photos chronologically on his laptop screen, cross-referencing them with the bank statements. The first inconsistency jumped out immediately. 3 weeks ago, Delphine had sent him a photo of a medical bill, allegedly from her cardiologist, with a payment due date of March 15th. But Javon's bank records showed he'd transferred the money on March 8th, a full week before she'd supposedly received the bill. He checked the timestamp on her text message, then double-checked his transfer confirmation. The math didn't work. He dug deeper, examining other medical receipts Delphine had sent over the past 6 months. The pattern became clearer with each document, invoice numbers that repeated across different months, date formats that switched between American and European styles within the same medical practice, font inconsistencies that suggested documents had been created in different programs, possibly by different people. One receipt, supposedly from St. Mary's Pharmacy, listed medications Javon recognized: blood pressure pills, diabetes medication, heart supplements. Standard prescriptions for someone Delphine's age with her stated conditions. But the receipt formatting was identical to another one dated 3 months later, down to the spacing and alignment of the text fields. Either St. Mary's Pharmacy had filled the exact same prescription order twice, or someone was recycling paperwork. Javon pulled up a web browser and searched for St. Mary's Pharmacy along with the address listed on Delphine's receipts. The search returned no results. He tried different combinations: St. Mary's Medical Pharmacy, St. Mary's Pharmacy, even just the street address. Nothing. According to the internet, the pharmacy that had supposedly been filling Delphine's prescriptions for months simply didn't exist. His hands moved steadily across the keyboard, cross-referencing doctor names from Delphine's receipts with medical practice directories. Dr. Patricia Henley, supposedly Delphine's cardiologist, wasn't listed with the Baltimore Medical Association. Dr. James Morrison, her diabetes specialist, had no online presence despite allegedly practicing at a major medical center. One by one, the medical professionals Delphine had been citing proved to be phantoms. The engineering part of Javon's mind began constructing a framework for understanding what he was seeing. Hypothesis: the medical expenses were fabricated. Supporting evidence: non-existent doctors, impossible timelines, repeated invoice numbers. Variables to test: direct contact with the legitimate medical facilities, verification of Delphine's actual health status, deeper investigation into the money trail. He created a new folder on his laptop, Evidence Analysis, and began organizing his findings into categories: financial inconsistencies, document anomalies, timeline discrepancies. Each category told part of a story he was only beginning to understand, but the emerging picture was clear enough to make his stomach turn. For 3 years, he'd been funding something that had nothing to do with medical care. The question was what, and more importantly, when. Delphine had access to her deceased daughter's grieving husband and his steady income. She'd found his weak spot, his promise to Nyla, and had been exploiting it with surgical precision. If the paperwork was real, it would survive a closer look, and he was ready to look. The law office of Mitchell & Associates occupied the 3rd floor of a downtown building that had seen better decades. Javon sat in the waiting area, surrounded by leather-bound legal volumes and the quiet hum of air conditioning, wondering if he was overreacting. 3 days had passed since his discovery about the fake medical documents. 3 days of analyzing patterns and questioning everything he thought he knew about Delphine's situation. Attorney Richard Mitchell was younger than Javon had expected, maybe early 40s, with graying temples and the kind of direct gaze that suggested he didn't waste time on pleasantries. He reviewed Javon's initial explanation with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd seen every variation of family financial disputes. "So you've been supporting your mother-in-law's medical expenses for 3 years," Mitchell said, making notes on a yellow legal pad, "and now you have concerns about the legitimacy of those expenses." He looked up from his writing. "Before we go further, I need to ask you something that might seem obvious. Have you seen a copy of your wife's will?" The question hit Javon like cold water. In the chaos of grief and funeral arrangements, in the months of adjustment that followed Nyla's death, he'd simply assumed that estate matters had been handled properly. Delphine had mentioned probate proceedings, had talked about legal paperwork, and settling Nyla's affairs, but she'd never shown him any official documents. "I haven't," Javon admitted, feeling foolish for the first time since entering the office. "I assumed since there weren't many assets, and since Delphine was handling the arrangements." Mitchell's expression didn't change, but his pen moved more quickly across the legal pad. "Mr. Sterling, in Maryland, surviving spouses are typically the first in line for estate administration. The fact that you haven't seen probate documents after 3 years is unusual." He set down his pen and leaned forward slightly. "Let me explain how this works. When someone dies, their will has to be filed with the local court system within a reasonable time frame. The court oversees the distribution of assets and ensures debts are properly settled. This process creates public records." The attorney's explanation was methodical, professional, but Javon caught the undertone of concern. Mitchell had seen this before. Family members excluded from estate proceedings they should have been central to. "What I'd like to do," Mitchell continued, "is request copies of the probate docket from the courthouse. We'll see exactly what was filed, when it was filed, and who was listed as the executor." He pulled a checklist from his desk drawer and slid it across to Javon. "In the meantime, I'll need you to gather any documents you have related to your wife's estate, bank statements, insurance policies, anything that might show what assets existed at the time of her death." Javon scanned the checklist: death certificate, marriage license, bank records, insurance documentation. Most of it he could provide easily, but seeing the items laid out in black and white made him realize how little he actually knew about the legal aftermath of Nyla's death. "How long does this kind of records request usually take?" he asked. "For basic probate information? A few days, maybe a week." Mitchell's voice carried a note of caution. "Mr. Sterling, I want you to be prepared for the possibility that what we find might be complicated. Estate disputes can reveal family dynamics that weren't apparent during normal circumstances." The attorney's careful phrasing didn't mask the warning underneath. Whatever they discovered in those court records might change everything about Javon's relationship with Delphine, might reframe 3 years of what he'd believed to be genuine need and gratitude. As Javon left the office with Mitchell's business card and the document checklist, he felt a strange mixture of dread and relief. For 3 years, he'd been operating on assumption and good faith, trusting that his weekly payments were helping someone he cared about. Now he was about to discover whether that trust had been misplaced. He wasn't chasing suspicion anymore. He was chasing a record. The following Tuesday, Javon called Delphine with what he hoped sounded like a spontaneous idea. I've been thinking about doing something special for Nyla's birthday next month, he said, keeping his voice casual. Maybe I could put together a small memorial display with some of her things. I know you have her jewelry box and those photo albums in the memory room. The silence on the other end stretched long enough for Javon to wonder if the call had dropped. When Delphine finally spoke, her voice carried a tension he'd never heard before. Oh, honey, that's such a sweet thought, but I'm not sure now is the right time, she said, the words coming too quickly. The memory room is, well, I've been having such a hard time going in there lately. Too emotional, you know. I've actually been keeping it locked because it's just too painful to see all her things. Javon frowned. In the months immediately after Nyla's death, Delphine had often invited him to sit in that room, surrounded by photo albums and mementos. She talked about how comforting it was to be close to her daughter's belongings, how she liked to go there when she missed Nyla most. The locked door was a new development. I understand, he said carefully, but maybe it would help both of us to do something meaningful with her things. We don't have to spend long in there, just enough to pick out a few special pieces. The room needs to be cleaned anyway, Delphine said, her voice growing more agitated. I've been meaning to organize everything properly, but with my health issues, it's just been overwhelming. Maybe after I get everything sorted out, we can talk about a memorial display. When Javon arrived at Delphine's house on Saturday morning, he brought coffee and pastries from the bakery Nyla had loved, a peace offering wrapped in shared memories. Delphine met him at the door wearing the same performed frailty he'd witnessed before, but today it seemed more pronounced, more deliberate. They sat in the living room making small talk about the weather and Delphine's latest doctor appointments, the conversation following its familiar script of vague complaints and grateful acknowledgments. But Javon's attention kept drifting to the hallway that led to the back bedrooms, specifically to the door he knew led to Nyla's memory room. Would you mind if I used your bathroom? He asked during a lull in conversation. Of course, honey. You know where it is. The hallway felt different as Javon walked down it, his footsteps muffled by the same carpet that had been there since Nyla's childhood. The bathroom was at the end of the hall, but the memory room door was halfway down on the right. As he passed it, Javon noticed something that made him pause. The door wasn't just locked. There were fresh scratches around the keyhole, as if it had been opened and closed repeatedly with some urgency. More telling was the line of dust that had been disturbed along the bottom of the doorframe, swept aside by recent foot traffic. Someone had been going in and out of that room regularly, despite Delphine's claims that it was too painful to enter. When he returned to the living room, Delphine was fidgeting with her hands, her eyes darting toward the hallway as if she could sense what he'd observed. Everything all right? She asked, the question carrying more weight than casual concern. Fine, Javon said, settling back into his chair. But his mind was cataloging details. The key that never left Delphine's keychain, the fresh scratches on old brass, the carefully constructed story about emotional difficulty accessing a room that was clearly being used regularly. Their conversation continued for another 20 minutes, but Javon found himself studying Delphine's face more intently than before. Every gesture, every pause, every deflection felt calculated now. She was guarding something in that room, something important enough to lie about, something that required regular access despite her claims of overwhelming grief. As he prepared to leave, Javon made one more casual attempt. If you change your mind about the memorial display, just let me know. I could help you clean the room if the task feels too big to handle alone. The flash of panic in Delphine's eyes was unmistakable, quickly covered by another wave of performed exhaustion. That's kind of you to offer, but I really need to handle Nyla's things myself, mother to daughter, you understand? He didn't need to force the door. He just needed to learn who was so afraid of it opening. The probate docket arrived in Mitchell's office on a Thursday morning, and Javon found himself staring at legal documents that reframed everything he thought he knew about his wife's death. The papers were official, stamped and filed with the Baltimore County Courthouse, but the timeline made his blood run cold. The will was filed 2 weeks after the funeral, Mitchell said, sliding the documents across his desk. That's unusual but not illegal. However, look at the witness signature here. He pointed to a line near the bottom of the page. The person who witnessed your wife's will is listed as Jerome Washington. Do you know anyone by that name? Javon studied the signature, then shook his head. I've never heard that name before. Nyla never mentioned anyone called Jerome Washington. Neither had I until I ran a background check. Mitchell pulled out another sheet of paper. Washington has no permanent address listed with the court. No employment history in Maryland. No voter registration, no property ownership, no credit history. For all practical purposes, this witness appears to have materialized just long enough to sign legal documents. The implications hit Javon like a physical blow. Someone paid him to witness a fake will. That's one possibility, Mitchell said carefully. The other details are equally troubling. Look at the executor information. He pointed to another section of the document. The estate executor is listed as using a post office box instead of a residential address. Again, not illegal, but combined with the mysterious witness, it suggests someone wanted to maintain distance from official scrutiny. Javon's hands were steady as he read through the probate filing, but his mind was racing through the implications. If Nyla's will had been falsified, if someone had manipulated the legal process while he was drowning in grief, then everything about the past 3 years had been built on deliberate deception. There's one more thing, Mitchell continued. The will as filed makes no mention of you as a beneficiary or as having any rights to estate administration. Given that you were the surviving spouse, that's not just unusual, it's suspicious. Most married couples either have joint accounts that pass automatically to the survivor or wills that recognize spousal inheritance rights. The lawyer's words felt distant, clinical, but they painted a picture that made Javon's stomach turn. While he'd been planning Nyla's funeral, while he'd been trying to hold himself together long enough to say goodbye to the woman he'd loved for 8 years, someone had been manipulating legal documents to cut him out of decisions about her estate. That afternoon, Javon sat in his car outside Delphine's house, staring at her front door, while he processed what he'd learned. The probate documents, the fake witness, the mysterious executor. It all pointed back to the woman who had been receiving his weekly payments for 3 years. The woman who had positioned herself as Nyla's grieving mother, deserving of his support and consideration. He called her cell phone, keeping his voice level despite the rage building in his chest. Delphine, I had a question about Nyla's estate. I was talking to a lawyer about some financial planning, and he mentioned something about probate records. Do you remember who witnessed Nyla's will? The pause before Delphine answered told him everything he needed to know, but her response confirmed it. Oh, honey, you know how overwhelming all that legal stuff was right after we lost Nyla. I can't remember every detail from such a difficult time. Her voice carried the familiar notes of manufactured vulnerability. Why are you asking about old paperwork? Is something wrong? I just wanted to make sure everything was handled properly, Javon said. The lawyer mentioned a name, Jerome Washington. Does that ring any bells? The explosion of guilt and accusation that followed was swift and vicious. Javon Sterling, I cannot believe you're questioning how I handled my own daughter's affairs. Do you think I would do anything improper when it came to Nyla's memory? Her voice rose to a pitch that suggested genuine outrage, but underneath it, Javon heard something else. Fear. And after everything I've been through, after all the support you have given me, how can you even suggest that I... The line went dead. Delphine had hung up on him, cutting off her own performance mid-sentence. The way she panicked told him the truth had a signature and it wasn't his. Javon didn't call Delphine back that night, or the next day, or the day after that. He let the silence stretch between them like a wire under tension, knowing that the absence of his usual Friday transfer would create the kind of pressure that forced people to show their true intentions. By Wednesday evening, his phone was buzzing with increasingly frantic text messages. Honey, I'm so sorry about how our conversation ended. I was just overwhelmed by all the legal talk. Can we please talk? Javon, I'm worried about you. You haven't returned my calls. Did I say something wrong? The pharmacy called about my prescription. I need to pay them by Friday or they won't fill my heart medication. Each message followed the same playbook. Apology, concern, urgency disguised as medical need. But Javon was done playing by Delphine's rules. Friday morning came and went without a transfer, and by afternoon his phone was ringing constantly. He answered on the fourth call, his voice calm and businesslike. Hello, Delphine. Javon, thank God. I've been so worried about you. Her relief was palpable, but underneath it was something sharper, more desperate. I know we had a misunderstanding, but I hope you're not going to let that affect your promise to Nyla. No misunderstanding, Javon said evenly. I've just decided to change how I handle your medical support. Instead of sending you cash, I'm going to pay your doctors and pharmacies directly. That way I can make sure the money is going exactly where Nyla would have wanted it to go. The silence that followed was so complete that Javon wondered if the call had dropped. When Delphine finally spoke, her voice had lost all pretense of frailty. "That's not how this works, Javon. My medical situation is complicated, and I need flexibility in how I manage my payments. You can't just decide to change our arrangement without consulting me." "I'm not changing anything," he replied. "I'm still providing the same support I promised Nyla. I'm just making sure it actually goes to medical expenses." He paused, letting the implication hang in the air. "Unless there's a reason you don't want me paying the doctors directly?" Delphine's response came too quickly, the words tumbling over each other in her haste to regain control. "Of course there's no reason. It's just that you don't understand how complicated my insurance situation is, and if they get direct payments, it might affect my coverage. And besides, what if they call and—" She stopped mid-sentence, realizing what she'd almost said. "What if they call and what, Delphine?" "Nothing, this is stressful for me, Javon. I'm not feeling well, and all this financial confusion is making my heart condition worse." She was retreating back into her familiar script, but the mask had slipped too far to be convincing. "I understand this is stressful," Javon said, his voice remaining steady and reasonable. "That's exactly why I want to simplify things for you. No more worrying about managing payments or keeping track of receipts. I'll handle everything directly with your medical providers." He let a beat of silence pass. "All I need from you are the names and contact information for your doctors and pharmacy." "I can't give you that information," Delphine said, the words rushing out before she could stop them. "I mean, I don't have it handy, and I'd need to organize everything. And with my condition—" "Then I'll wait," Javon said simply. "Until you can provide me with the information I need to pay your medical expenses directly, I'm suspending the weekly transfers." The sound Delphine made was somewhere between a gasp and a snarl. "You can't do this to me, Javon. I depend on that money. You promised Nimlala you'd take care of me." "And I will take care of you," he replied. "The moment you give me the information I need to pay your actual medical bills." He paused, feeling the power dynamics shift beneath his words like tectonic plates realigning. "Unless, of course, there are no actual medical bills to pay." The line went dead again, but this time Javon knew he was the one in control. That unfinished sentence sounded less like illness and more like exposure. Finding Jerome Washington took Javon 3 days of methodical searching through public records and social media networks. The name that had appeared on Nyla's probate documents led to a man living in a subsidized apartment complex in East Baltimore. Someone with no apparent connection to Delphine or anyone in Nyla's family. When Javon called the number he'd found through a reverse directory search, the voice that answered was wary, suspicious. "Yeah, this is Jerome." "Who's asking?" "My name is Javon Sterling. I think you witnessed some legal documents for my late wife, Nyla Sterling, about 3 years ago. I was hoping we could talk." The pause stretched long enough for Javon to wonder if Jerome was going to hang up, but eventually the man's voice returned, quieter now. "Look, I don't want any trouble, all right, Cat? I just did what the lady asked me to do. Signed some papers, got paid. That was it. I'm not looking to cause trouble for you," Javon said carefully. "I just want to understand what happened. Would you be willing to meet somewhere public? I'll buy you lunch and we can talk." They met at a diner on Eastern Avenue, the kind of place where coffee came in heavy white mugs and the waitress called everyone "un bon." Jerome Washington was younger than Javon had expected, maybe 35, with the careful posture of someone who'd learned to be cautious around strangers. He ordered coffee and kept his hands visible on the table, watching Javon with the alertness of a man who'd been caught in legal complications before. "I want to be clear about something right up front," Jerome said after their waitress had moved on to other customers. "I didn't know what I was signing. The lady, older black woman, said she was settling her daughter's estate. She just asked me to witness her signature on some papers. Said it was routine legal stuff, nothing complicated." "When did this happen?" Javon asked. 2, maybe 3 weeks after some funeral. "She found me through a guy I know who does odd jobs around the city, moving furniture, cleaning out houses, that kind of thing. She said she needed a witness for estate paperwork and would pay $50 for 10 minutes of my time." Jerome shrugged, defensive but not apologetic. $50 is $50, you know? I needed the money. Javon nodded, keeping his expression neutral. "Where did you meet her to sign the documents?" "Some law office downtown, small place, looked legitimate enough." The lawyer guy was there, had all the papers laid out. Jerome's eyes narrowed slightly. But thinking back on it, the whole thing felt rushed, like they wanted to get me in and out before I could read too much of what I was signing. Do you remember the lawyer's name? Nah, but I remember there were two envelopes on his desk, big manila ones, both sealed up. The lady took one with her when we left, but she told the lawyer to hold on to the other one. Made a big deal about how he wasn't supposed to file it with the court or whatever. Javon's pulse quickened, but he kept his voice steady. Did you see what was written on the envelope she told him not to file? Jerome was quiet for a moment, staring into his coffee cup as if the memory was floating somewhere in the dark liquid. Yeah, actually, it had something written on it in handwriting. Looked like second will or something like that. The words hit Javon like electricity, confirming suspicions he'd barely allowed himself to form. There had been two wills, one filed with the court that cut him out of Nyla's estate, and another that had been deliberately hidden. The woman who'd been taking his money for 3 years had orchestrated a legal deception that began while he was still planning his wife's funeral. Jerome, Javon said carefully, I need to ask you something important. Did the woman who hired you, did she seem like she was grieving? Did she act like someone who'd just lost her daughter? The man across from him considered the question seriously, his expression growing thoughtful. You know what? No, she didn't. I've been to my share of funerals, seen people dealing with loss. This lady was focused, organized, like she was handling business, not like someone torn up about losing family. They talked for another 20 minutes, Jerome providing details about the law office location, the timing of the meeting, the atmosphere of efficiency rather than the grief that had surrounded the document signing. When they parted ways, Jerome looked relieved to have finally told someone the truth about what had felt wrong to him, even at the time. In his car afterward, Javon sat with his hands on the steering wheel, processing what he'd learned. Delphine hadn't just been lying about medical expenses. She'd been orchestrating a legal fraud that had roots going back to the day Nyla died. There was another will, one that had been deliberately concealed, and Javon was starting to understand that everything he'd believed about his wife's final wishes had been carefully constructed fiction. Before he left, the man mentioned a sealed envelope that never should have disappeared. Jerome's words echoed in Javon's brain for 3 sleepless nights. Second will. The phrase felt like a key turning in a lock he hadn't known existed, opening possibilities that reframed everything about Nyla's death and its aftermath. When he called Jerome back on Sunday morning, his voice carried the weight of barely contained urgency. I need you to think carefully about that envelope you saw, Javon said. The one with the handwriting on it. Can you remember anything else about what it said or what it looked like? Jerome was quiet for a long moment, and Javon could hear traffic in the background, the distant sound of city life continuing while his world shifted on its axis. The writing was kind of fancy, like someone took time with it. And there was something else underneath second will. Looked like a date, maybe? I remember thinking it was weird that there were 2 different envelopes for the same person. Do you remember what the lawyer looked like? Anything that might help me track down that office? White guy, maybe 50-something, had one of those thin mustaches that looks like he draws it on every morning. The office was on the 3rd floor of some old building downtown, maybe near the courthouse. Jerome paused. Look, man, I hope you find what you're looking for, but I don't want to get pulled into anything complicated. I just signed papers for $50. After the call ended, Javon sat in his kitchen staring at a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. The existence of a second will meant that everything Delphine had told him about Nyla's final wishes was potentially fabricated. More importantly, it meant Nyla herself might have anticipated the kind of manipulation that had followed her death. His hands shook slightly as he pulled out his laptop and began researching estate attorneys in downtown Baltimore. If Jerome was right about the location, there were maybe a dozen law firms within walking distance of the courthouse that fit the description. Javon started making calls, using a story he'd rehearsed about needing to verify some estate documents for insurance purposes. On his 6th call, the receptionist's voice brightened with recognition. Oh yes, Mr. Sterling. We've been wondering when you'd contact us about your wife's sealed documents. Mr. Patterson has been holding an envelope for you, waiting for proper identification and authorization. Javon's chest tightened. I'm sorry, could you repeat that? The sealed envelope from your wife's estate. We've had it in our vault for almost 3 years, per her specific instructions. She was very clear that it should only be released to her husband upon proper request. The receptionist's voice carried the efficient warmth of someone delivering routine good news. Would you like to schedule an appointment to retrieve it? The drive downtown felt surreal, like moving through a dream where familiar landmarks had taken on entirely new meaning. Patterson and Associates occupied a narrow building wedged between a bail bondsman and a tax preparation service, exactly the kind of modest law firm that might handle routine estate work without asking uncomfortable questions. Attorney Gerald Patterson was indeed a thin man with a carefully maintained mustache, and when he saw Javon's identification, his expression shifted from professional courtesy to something approaching relief. Mr. Sterling, I have to tell you, I've been concerned about this envelope for quite some time. Your wife was very specific about her instructions, but it seemed unusual that you never came to claim it. I never knew it existed, Javon said simply. Patterson's eyebrows rose. That's troubling. Mrs. Sterling made it clear that you should be informed about the sealed document immediately after the initial probate filing. He walked to a filing cabinet and withdrew a large manila envelope, its surface marked with Nyla's distinctive handwriting. She specifically requested that this be kept separate from any other estate documents and only released directly to you. Javon stared at the envelope, recognizing his wife's careful script. Second will for Javon only, not to be opened except in his presence with legal witness. Below that, in smaller letters, if you're reading this, it means someone tried to hide the truth. His throat felt dry as dust. What exactly did my wife tell you about this envelope? She said she was concerned about potential family complications after her death, Patterson replied carefully. She wanted to ensure that certain provisions would be protected from interference. She paid me a retainer specifically to hold this document and ensure it reached you directly. Patterson arranged for a colleague to witness the opening of the envelope, and in the sterile environment of a law office conference room, Javon finally discovered what Nyla had been trying to tell him from beyond the grave. The second will was brief, written in Nyla's own hand, but its contents reframed 3 years of his life. If Javon is reading this, it means my mother has manipulated the probate process to hide my real wishes. I love my mother, but I know her weaknesses. Any financial support for her must be transparent and supervised, or she will take advantage of my husband's grief and good nature. The weekly medical payments should go directly to verified providers, not to cash accounts she controls. Javon, you are not responsible for enabling manipulation disguised as need. He didn't need revenge. He needed access to what had been sealed away from him. Patterson's firm had kept meticulous records, and within 2 hours of opening Nyla's sealed envelope, Javon found himself following a paper trail that led back to the original law firm that had handled his wife's estate planning. The attorney who had witnessed Jerome Washington's signature had been acting on behalf of a legitimate practice, but he'd been given incomplete information about what documents he was processing. Your wife was very thorough, Patterson explained as they reviewed the timeline. She filed the original will with our firm 6 months before her death, then came back 3 weeks later to add the sealed instructions. She specifically mentioned concerns about family pressure and wanted to ensure you'd have access to her real wishes if anyone tried to manipulate the probate process. The revelation that Nyla had anticipated Delphine's behavior felt like a cold wind cutting through 3 years of guilt and obligation. His wife had known her mother well enough to predict exactly what would happen after her death. The guilt manipulation, the fake medical expenses, the systematic exploitation of his grief. Patterson made copies of the second will and provided Javon with a notarized letter confirming its authenticity and legal standing. More importantly, he explained how the original estate documents could be challenged based on the new evidence of fraud and misrepresentation. The probate court takes document fraud very seriously, Patterson said. If you can prove that the original filing was based on falsified information, they'll investigate the entire estate administration. That could mean recovering assets that were improperly distributed and certainly stopping any ongoing financial obligations that were based on fraudulent claims. The drive home gave Javon time to process the magnitude of what he discovered. Nyla hadn't just left him a warning about her mother. She'd left him a legal roadmap for protecting himself. The second will included specific provisions for how Delphine should be supported: transparent medical billing, verified providers, supervised financial assistance. It was the framework for genuine help rather than exploitation. That evening, Javon called Mitchell to report what he'd found and to begin the process of challenging the original probate filing. The attorney's response was immediate and decisive. "This changes everything," Mitchell said after reviewing the scanned documents Javon had sent. "We're not just talking about suspicious financial behavior anymore. We're dealing with deliberate estate fraud. I'll need to file a motion with the probate court, but based on what you've shown me, there's a strong case for reopening the entire estate administration." "How long will that take?" "A few weeks for the initial court review, longer if they decide to investigate the circumstances around the original filing. But Mr. Sterling, you should prepare yourself for the possibility that this will become adversarial. Once we file these documents, your mother-in-law will know that you've discovered her deception." Javon stared out his kitchen window at the neighborhood where he'd built a life with Nyla, where he'd been quietly mourning her for 3 years while unknowingly funding a lie. The house felt different now, lighter somehow, as if a weight he hadn't realized he was carrying had finally been lifted. "I'm ready for adversarial," he said. "I've been playing defense for 3 years. It's time to get my wife's real wishes honored." After the call ended, Javon sat in his living room, surrounded by the evidence of his investigation: bank statements, legal documents, photos of fake medical receipts. The accumulation of proof felt like archaeology, layers of deception being carefully excavated to reveal the truth underneath. His phone buzzed with a text message from Delphine. "Javon, please call me. We need to talk about this situation. I know you're upset, but there are things you don't understand." He deleted the message without responding. For the first time in 3 years, Delphine was the one who needed something from him. And Javon was done with her timeline, her emergencies, her carefully constructed crises. With the sealed envelope on the table, he realized the truth wasn't coming. It was already here. The mediated conference room at Patterson and Associates felt nothing like a courtroom, but the atmosphere carried the weight of 3 years of deception finally reaching its conclusion. Delphine sat across from Javon with her own attorney, a tired-looking public defender who'd clearly explained that her position was legally indefensible. When Patterson opened the sealed envelope and read Nyla's handwritten will aloud, Delphine's face went through a series of transformations: surprise, anger, and finally resignation. "When Hayes," Patterson said after finishing Nyla's letter, "your daughter was quite specific about her concerns regarding financial manipulation. She anticipated exactly the situation that has developed over the past 3 years." He gestured to the stack of evidence Javon had compiled: the falsified medical documents, the non-existent healthcare, the manipulation of probate records. "All of this directly contradicts your daughter's expressed wishes." Delphine's attorney leaned forward. "My client is willing to discuss a resolution that avoids criminal fraud charges." For the first time in 3 years, Javon looked directly at his mother-in-law without the filter of guilt or obligation. She appeared smaller somehow, diminished by the exposure of her schemes. The performance of frailty had been abandoned, replaced by the sharp-eyed calculation of someone caught in an elaborate lie. "Delphine," Javon said quietly, "Nyla loved you, but she knew you well enough to protect both of us from this situation. She didn't want you to struggle, but she also didn't want you to take advantage of my grief." Delphine's voice, when she finally spoke, carried none of its familiar manipulation. "You don't understand what it's like to lose your only child and then watch her husband move on with his life while you're left with nothing." "I haven't moved on," Javon replied evenly. "I've been honoring what I thought were Nyla's wishes for 3 years. But those weren't her wishes. They were yours." The resolution was swift and comprehensive. The fraudulent probate filing would be corrected, with the court officially recognizing Nyla's second will. Delphine would repay a portion of the money she'd received under false pretenses, with the repayment schedule supervised by the court. Any future financial assistance would follow Nyla's guidelines: transparent medical billing, verified providers, supervised distribution. Most importantly, the weekly transfer ritual that had defined Javon's Friday mornings for 3 years would end permanently. If Delphine had legitimate medical needs, there were proper channels for requesting help, channels that required documentation and accountability. As they left the law office, Delphine walked past Javon without speaking. Her attorney had advised against any contact that wasn't supervised by legal counsel, but Javon sensed her silence ran deeper than legal strategy. She'd been exposed not just as manipulative, but as someone who had weaponized her own daughter's death for financial gain. The following Saturday, Javon drove to Riverside Cemetery for the first time since Nyla's funeral. Her grave was simple, marked by a granite headstone that bore her name dates, and the inscription they'd chosen together years earlier. She chose love over everything else. The words carried new meaning now, knowing that Nyla had chosen to protect him even from beyond the grave. He knelt beside the headstone and placed a small bouquet of sunflowers, her favorite, against the cool stone. "I found your letter," he said quietly. "Thank you for knowing me well enough to save me from myself." The afternoon was warm, peaceful, filled with the distant sound of traffic and the closer murmur of wind through old oak trees. For 3 years, his weekly routine had been defined by obligation to someone who was exploiting his grief. Now, sitting in the grass beside his wife's grave, Javon felt something he'd almost forgotten: the simple peace of honoring someone's memory without agenda or manipulation. As he stood to leave, Javon made a mental note to return next weekend, not out of obligation or ritual, but because he wanted to. Because choosing to remember Nyla in his own way, on his own timeline, felt like the first genuinely free decision he'd made since her death. He didn't walk away with revenge, he walked away with himself. Grief can make us vulnerable to manipulation, but it doesn't have to define our choices forever. Javon's story reminds us that honoring our loved ones means protecting ourselves from those who would exploit our pain for their gain. True love seeks transparency, not control. When someone consistently avoids accountability while demanding your support, they're showing you exactly who they are. Believe them. What would you do if you discovered 3 years of your grief had been weaponized against you? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and if this story resonated with you, please hit that like button. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.